Reading 121 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll, Volume 3. Great Animal House, May 15th, 1948. Self-change. Change of attitude. Work idea. To change, a man must change his attitudes. Commentary. Last time we spoke of this intractable factor, common to all and lying in our depth, that causes us to react finally by violence. We spoke about loss of face and so on. Today we speak about attitudes and their connection with this deep factor. Attitudes are acquired from the outer influences of life, such as education, country, religion, social position and its prejudices, and so on. Very soon a man, a woman, become their acquired attitudes through identifying. They indeed are their attitudes without knowing it. The basic idea of propaganda is to instill certain attitudes at an early age. If this is done with success, a person quite unconscious of his attitudes becomes them. This means that if you talk to such a person about anything that strikes against an attitude, he cannot hear what you say. I fancy this explains many apparently inexplicable things about others and about oneself. Now, attitudes begin to be formed in the intellectual center from what one is told, and then act on the emotional center. That is, an attitude does not begin in the emotional center. It begins with things you were told and accepted. These acquired attitudes, laid down in the mind, cause everyone to think from them. We think, insofar as we ever do, from these undetected attitudes. As long as these attitudes govern the mind, a man's thinking is not free, but is controlled by them. Yes, but the person is unaware that this is the case. He believes he thinks in freedom, from himself. Certainly he thinks from himself, but he does not see that what he takes as himself is not really himself, but a number of fixed attitudes that are continually acting on him, without his knowledge. The work is about tearing oneself away from this acquired side, so that centers can work naturally. If centers were not overlaid by attitudes and associations, they would give us a quite different and richer life. Somewhere it is said in Scripture that God made man upright, but that he has sought out many inventions. One invention is the invention of what he calls himself. But it takes a long time to see that one is really an invention, and that something very deep knows this quite well. Gurdjieff once said that people came to him and said they would give up everything to follow him, but when it came to giving up their ingrained attitudes, they were offended and left. In the same connection, Mr. Ouspensky said that when people had reached a certain stage of inner development, they came to the point where they had to give up their particular beliefs, whether they were Mohammedans, Anglicans, Catholics, Quakers, Presbyterians, Baptists, or whatever it might be. I remember his words. This, he said, is the most difficult thing to do, and at this stage, I'm speaking of schools, many leave. They go so far, but cannot give themselves up. He was speaking of acquired attitudes and how difficult it is to free oneself from them. Now, what I want to point out, by way of commentary, is that our attitudes seem to rest upon this intractable, difficult, and violent thing in us that must eventually yield, so that we can become passive to ourselves and hear what higher centers are saying to us all the time. As I said last time, only the practical experience, that there is something far above us can make this intractable thing bow down and submit. No outer compulsion, no outer rules or discipline can do this. Only a long series of inner experiences that for a long time one only half believes in can make it possible. The, so to speak, intractable, violent, prehistoric man or prehistoric woman has to become transformed into an accepting of all that you would at present never think of accepting. As I said, amor propre has to give way to amor Dei. And in this connection, reflection upon the significance of the ray of creation can at least begin to alter our thinking, because it gives an idea of our own smallness and insignificance. Today, I want those who heard the last paper to consider the question as to whether they can agree that their acquired and unchallenged attitudes receive their secret force from this intractable and violent basis of what Orthodox religion calls unregenerate man. That is, man not yet reborn in himself. I believe from my own observation that this is the case. Now, when a man observes himself, he observes a lot of things that have their own importance, but he does not observe his attitudes. To speak with exaggeration, I may believe myself God, as so many lunatics do, which shows you how close this idea is to people. Since I believe myself God, I will never think of observing this in myself. Why? Because I take this attitude for granted. To believe oneself God is an attitude. So of course I will never think of observing that. Well, it is just the same with all attitudes. One simply accepts them, or rather one simply does not know that one has them, so one does not think of observing them. In fact, one simply cannot observe them and cannot hear anyone who is such a fool as to try to call attention to them. You cannot observe anything you take yourself as. A man, says the work, before he can shift from where he is internally, must divide himself into two, an observing side and an observed side. That is, he must make his subjectivity objective. He must take himself as the object to observe. But if he remains entirely unconscious of his attitudes, how can he observe them? The most of what self-observation we can do is made useless by subsequent self-justifying. A man, said Mr. Ouspensky, who always justifies what he observes in himself cannot become objective to himself. That is understandable if you reflect. But how can one observe something that is, so to speak, unobservable? One's attitudes are oneself. One takes them as oneself. No, one does not know anything about them. One does not say, these attitudes I have acquired are me. On the contrary, one does not say anything. They are what you take for granted as you. If one could say, these attitudes are me, then it would mean that one has begun to become a little aware of them. That is, these attitudes would begin to be objective to you, to things in yourself that observing eye can observe. But if you remain in inner darkness, how can you proceed? Well, I will end this short commentary by saying that although it is impossible to observe ingrained and fixed attitudes directly, one can begin after some time to notice the results of them. For example, you may begin to wonder why you always grunt like that when someone asks you to do something useless. You may say to yourself after a time, I wonder why I always think that thing useless. The answer is probably because of some fixed attitude that you are entirely unaware of. In this way, one is led down to the fact of the existence of these attitudes in oneself. If such a merciful thing has happened to you, that is, if the work has given you internal help, you will realize that behind this attitude that you begin at last to become conscious of dwells secretly this intractable factor common to us all. Remember that you cannot work on yourself unless you begin to wonder why you say what you say, and do what you do, and behave as you behave, and feel what you feel, and think what you think. To take yourself for granted, to imagine you are always right, to ascribe to yourself all that you do ascribe to yourself, all that form of sheer imagination will prevent you from seeing what esotericism means, what the Gospels mean, and what you mean.